All right, so our speaker tonight is Dr. Jessica Cook-Hale, a marine geologist who holds a master's in geology and a PhD in anthropology from the University of Georgia. Her research synthesizes geological methods alongside anthropological and archaeological theory to examine submerged landscapes. She's currently a postdoctoral research associate at the Submerged Landscapes Research Center at the University of Bradford in the UK, and she's authored papers focused on geoarchaeological studies of submerged landscape features such as shell middens, corrosion processes that affect lithics from submerged sites, and applications of anthropological theory and offshore site prediction model formation. So thank you so much for joining us. I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you for everyone that has come along to this talk. Hopefully, I can provide something that will be of some interest and use to you all today. Really appreciate the warm welcome. Let me go ahead and get this screen share up. This is always the toughest part of the technological journey, isn't it? And let's make sure that this is doing what it's supposed to do. All right. Please let me know if there are any problems with viewing the video or if anything has gone sideways, as we say. Again, thank you very much for coming and for the warm welcome. I'd like to sort of introduce the talk today by telling you what I'm going to do, because my old major professor used to say, tell them what you're going to say it, then tell them what you said. I hope to be a little bit less straightforward than that in all the best ways, but I do like to give folks that turn up kind of an idea of where we want to go tonight, because when we do archaeology, in a sense, although we're collecting data, we are telling stories, and these stories need to matter. And the work that we do in submerged landscapes, not going to lie, it's really cool on its own, right? Putting on life support gear, putting on scuba gear, hopping in the water, and having the honor and the privilege to explore landscapes and habitations and materials that last got 7, 8,000, 9,000 years ago. It's a privilege and it's fun on its own. But that being said, I would make the argument that submerged paleolandscape prospection and assessment has very real implications for both how we understand ourselves as human beings and the human journey across the globe. And it's got real intersections that are meaningful and matter very much for communities today. So I'm going to set the stage by telling you first, why do we even care about submerged landscapes above and beyond scuba gear, pointy rocks, getting to get on boats? I want to frame this with the archaeological questions that we want to ask and answer, and explain to you, tell you the story, as it were, about how what I and my colleagues do can inform these narratives and inform our knowledge of ourselves today. Then I'm going to take a little bit of a turn and go into a methods review. I will just focus primarily on what I've been doing in Appalachia Bay for about 10 years now, and I will talk to you a bit about the various approaches we take, from sort of a landscape-wide perspective to really, really focused inquiries on sites and the sediments within them themselves. Gonna warn you, there's a few graphs with some points on them and some statistics, but I'll keep it relatively painless. And then once we've gotten through that experience, then I want to back out a little bit more and talk to you about remote sensing surveys and how we apply them, again, with a focus on landscapes and even whole regions. The last thing I'll do, once we've gone through these topics tonight, and hopefully I can do it in a timely fashion, is then I would like to tell you why we do what we do, where it intersects policy and law and environmental permitting, and where communities really matter in these conversations, and thus why it is so important for people like me, gigantic nerds with too many letters after their names, really need to connect and desire to connect with communities so that we can work together as a whole when dealing with both our shared cultural history as well as modern initiatives on the modern coastlines today that are meant to, mitigate against climate change and sea level rise as it affects us today. So that's kind of your primer. Hope it's not too much. And with all that being said, I'm just going to kind of jump right in and get to work. So really, we want to think about, why do we care, right? When we first talk about why we do these things. I had family members that were absolutely horrified when I went to graduate school. We're going to do what? And how does that even matter? Well, once we start talking about the current offshore work I'm doing in Florida, hopefully I can show you a bit more about what that tells us and why we care. And then, as I said a minute ago, I'm going to pull all this together and talk to you a bit about applications to private sector needs and development initiatives. The photo that you see of the gigantic wind farm was just taken last November on an offshore cruise that we did off the coast of Belgium in the North Sea, which was a wonderful experience in and of itself. But it really gives you a sense of the scale of these installations when they go in. And this is where so much submerged landscape archaeology has gone on, continues to go on, and will very much in the future, be carried forward. So the other thing that we'll have to talk about, and this isn't really grim, but it is informative, I would hope, is not just where our current knowledge basis is, but also where there's some training gaps. Because for those of you who are perhaps interested in pursuing studies in this, I want to share my own thoughts, and it's just my opinion, as we say, but I would like to share my own observations and maybe offer some insights, hopefully, that might assist for those of you that are going into archaeology as a profession. So let's talk about why we care. It's very simple, in my view. 40% of the world's modern population lives within about 60 miles of a shoreline. I don't know why that wouldn't have been different, I don't know why it would have been different, 25,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, when our ancestors were leaving Africa. And more studies emerge every month, it seems like, that demonstrate that there are so many things that happen on these shorelines, like migration pathways out of Africa. There's a paper that came out a couple of weeks ago from Australia, from a collection of very robust scholars there, that have modeled the continental shelf on the northern end of Australia. And not only have they found that there was an island archipelago that would have been exposed at the last ice age, there was also an inland sea. So even just these efforts right here at just mapping the seabed can show you the potential. There's so much human history that has taken place on these continental shelves that used to be coastal plains, and now they're under the waves. So one popular topic, and the one that I'm going to pick tonight to frame the discussion of what I'm doing these days, is the peopling of the Americas. And I don't know how plugged in anyone particularly cares to be. This can be quite contentious. If someone comes out with a paper that says folks turned up in New Mexico 22,000 years ago, then 3 months later, someone comes out with another radiocarbon calibration paper saying, no, it was 15. I don't really care when people turned up, because we'll never, ever see archaeologically that first footprint in this hemisphere. What I do care about, and what I'm fascinated by, how they got here. Because we are talking about people traveling on foot, maybe by boat, at a time when they didn't have GPS. They didn't have cell phones, obviously. They didn't have an easy way to get from point A to point B. And they must have been incredibly resilient and incredibly curious people. And my money says that at least some of them went by the coastlines. So let's talk a little bit about this peopling of the Americas. Let's talk about it first by looking at our landscape. I put together a few basic maps for tonight. Ice Age North America. This is what the landscape looked like 22,000 years ago. And that red star there is roughly placed approximately right about where White Sands, New Mexico would be, give or take a few hundred miles. I wasn't trying to be too precise, but I wanted you to see that locale, because that is a location where it is argued humans left footprints on a lake's edge 20,000 years ago. And if those dates hold, and it's a topic of vigorous debate, then this is what their continent looked like. And if you look, you will see that this ice mass offers no throughway from what is now Alaska into the mainland of North America. If you wanted to come by the so-called Bering Land Bridge, you were going to come to a dead stop when you get to the Laurentide and the Cordilleran ice sheets. There is no way forward 22,000 years ago from Alaska to White Sands. There still wasn't a way forward 16,800 years ago, or 15,500 years ago, which is a very conservative age for another important site, this time in the Pacific Northwest, Cooper's Ferry, where there is evidence of people using something called the Western Stemmed Point tool tradition, living on a tributary of the Snake River. They couldn't have got there if they had had to run up against that ice sheet. Maybe by 14,900 years ago, you could have done it. I don't think that that looks like a particularly inviting environment, though. It would have been a very difficult landscape. By 14,200 years ago, we are very confident that people were living in northern Florida, not very far from you all today, at the Page-Ladson site. And still, that throughway through those ice sheets was really not great. By 12,800 years ago, it might have gotten a little bit more hospitable, comparatively speaking. So by the time that the Clovis culture has been securely documented in Western North America, and that's the culture we know pretty much the most about and tend to think of first when we think of Paleo-Americans. By the time Clovis got established, then sure, yeah, you could get back and forth from what is now Alaska into the Great Plains, but again, it wouldn't have been terribly inviting. So here's a story that we've got to think about where we don't have a lot of information. We've got a few sites here and there. And what we know is that the environment was very forbidding. But there is one way that they could have gone, and it wouldn't have been this if they were coming into this continent 22,000 years ago. The shoreline remained ice-free. From Alaska all the way down the Canadian or the Alaskan Panhandle, along the Pacific Northwest coast of Canada, and into the Pacific Northwest coast of the US. And there are some very, very smart people who are doing some very, very interesting studies up in this area looking for these early sites. I'm not one of them. I'm going to give due credit where credit is due. They are really at the cutting edge here. I'm not in a position myself to be working on those early sites, but I am in a position to start thinking about what happened after, and did they stay on the coastlines, and how did they adapt once they got here? I had a little bit too much fun with my questions, I'll admit. So coming back to this, view from 38,000 feet here, it's obvious that entry into the Western Hemisphere was a complex process. I'm not ruling out the idea that people came along an interior pathway after those ice sheets opened up. I would argue, however, that the antiquity of archaeological sites and what we know about the climate strongly suggests that at least some of these folks came along the coastline. But submerged landscapes, which is where a lot of these early sites should logically be, while the antiquity of them was kind of noticed and the improved preservation in some conditions was also noted, up until about the 70s or 80s, nobody really did a whole lot about it. Now, there's one example of some really cool early paleontological work just up the road from you all, Wacala Springs. I've worked up there as well. It's quite cool, where an enormous amount of megafaunal remains have been recovered. And a lot of archaeology, very early archaeology, has been documented in the terrestrial context as well. But these finds up until 2030 were barely published. And the relationship even today between all these Pleistocene Ice Age animals and the human beings that lived side by side with them is still pretty unclear, I would argue. It's still pretty poorly understood. No concerted studies were done on submerged landscapes in the early to mid 20th century until places like Warm Mineral Springs began to yield astonishing finds. And even after that point, the implications for that entry into the Western Hemisphere was really ignored until the late 20th century. Part of this had to do with some biases that 19th and early 20th century archaeologists had, like Herlichka. Early sites in Florida, like the Vero Beach site, were rejected as being older than the Holocene, as being older than 10,000 years old. We know better now, but at the time, the idea that people couldn't have been here during the Ice Age really forestalled anyone even bothering to look, much less offshore. Now, that bias was broken in the mid-20th century by the finds at Folsom and at Clovis, Blackwater Draw, where all of these Paleo-American tools have been found in association with now extinct Ice Age animals, including one Folsom point that was found embedded in a couple of ancient bison ribs. So that sort of broke that barrier and got people to recognize people could have been here during the Ice Age, which then opens up the question of, well, did they use the landscape that is now underwater? This is just, again, a basic review of Clovis, Folsom, all of these cultures, none of them anywhere near the ocean that we know about right now, or at least in this area. This is all out in Mexico and Texas, right? This is on the but it's very important that we were able to, as a discipline, accept and understand that Paleo-Americans were living in direct contact with these megafauna and living in climate conditions and landscape conditions that would have allowed them to use these continental shelves. And just to reiterate, this is what their landscape would have looked like. The ice sheets to the north, what this illustration does not show you are all of the proglacial lakes that would have formed at the edges of these ice sheets that would have provided abundant ecological circumstances for people to do all kinds of things, not just obtain fresh water, but also hunt things like waterfowl. And these waterways provided avenues, it seems, for people to travel. And then you can also see, particularly with attention down to Florida and in the southeastern US, there's a whole expanse of coastal plain that was above the waves and is no longer so. Florida has lost just over 40% of its landmass since 22,000 years ago to today. So these early sites that were terrestrial, that got people to accept that folks had turned up here in the Ice Age, unfortunately, were generally characterized just by stone tools, really bad organic preservation, very difficult to date. And then the submerged sites are where these conditions often don't hold, where you can find wood and organic materials a lot more abundantly. They were barely assessed at all. Even until about 1979, when Fladmark published the Coastal Entry Hypothesis paper, there was no real discussion of offshore site potentials or connections to these early occupants. That is now changing. On land, coastal archaeologists from the West Coast to the East have started to put this picture together and to really ask and answer, not only could they have lived on these landscapes? Were they using watercraft? What was their culture like? How was it different? We've seen the Clovis points. We've seen the associations with the big megafauna. We think of them as big game hunters, and there's sort of a stereotype we have in our minds of what Paleo-Americans' lives were like. And yet, along the Channel Islands, they weren't hunting megafauna. Most of their diet was composed of birds. There were shell-midden deposits, big, giant heaps of shellfish that they had harvested for food. And these folks lived out there almost 12,000 years ago, and the Channel Islands have never been connected in any kind of geologic time frame in which human beings have existed. Those islands have never been connected to California, mainland. Those folks got out there by boat, and their material culture was not consistent with Clovis. And again, you see at the Cooper's Ferry site, the same sort of early Western tool tradition turns up. Some of those dates coming out of Cooper's Ferry are very debated, but I think it's reasonable to say folks were there 15,500 years ago. Again, further support for the hypothesis that the people who entered into the Western Hemisphere this long ago came along the coastline and at least developed boats once they got here if they didn't have them already. I would argue they probably already had them, but we can at least say by 11,700 years ago, they had figured it out and got to the Channel Islands under conditions like this. So the debate about first entry, just to recap before we move on to the cool underwater archaeology pictures. The debate where it stands now argues that this Clovis culture we know so much about probably developed here in North America, did not get imported, and that this Western stemmed point tradition that turns up in the Channel Islands and Cooper's Ferry and all along the West Coast is probably a little bit older and may be associated with these coastal people that came in early. I should mention that there are South American sites that are older than Clovis as well, and that the DNA studies, and I am not a DNA expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I can tell you the DNA studies do point to some fairly complex lineage histories. So on the continental shelves now, what we seek to do is to find those missing pieces of evidence that can help us reconstruct not just the physical landscape, but that human cultural landscape as well. And we're going to have to do a lot of work before that comes to fruition. Another reason why this is of interest, these are people that faced down significant climate change. They saw major species decline and disappear, sometimes in the span of a lifetime or two, certainly within the range of human oral history. There are all kinds of changing ice sheet configurations on the West Coast as the ice sheet disappeared. There's rebound. You've got tectonics going on out there, earthquakes. Whenever I look at the relative sea level curves for the Pacific Northwest, I think about the folks that do the really good work in the Alaskan Panhandle and say, better y'all than me, because it is a train wreck. And if it's a train wreck when we're trying to untangle it, it must have been a bit challenging for the people living within it. Just to illustrate the point about how much things have changed, anybody want to take a guess at where this is? I won't leave everyone on tenterhooks because we are time limited tonight. That's modern New England. This is what New England looked like 22,000 years ago. That's how much land they've lost, and that's how much it's changed. A little bit closer to home. Does this look at all familiar, maybe? Maybe, maybe not. That, my friends, is the northern Gulf Coast, the Mississippi Delta and Mobile Bay. It is dramatic how much these changes have affected these landscapes. And if you were living within them, then you had to be pretty quick to stick around, survive. And I would argue that these folks were good enough that they even thrived. So if we're going to pull together all these pieces, we've got to talk to a lot of colleagues. We've got to have these interdisciplinary approaches. Now, I've got the geology and the anthropology, but it also really needs, I really depend on my paleoecological peers, people that do true paleoclimate studies, paleontologists that can help me understand what the animals and plants were like. All of this is very, very important. This is a team sport. There is plenty of room for the kind of ego that gives you the drive and the ambition to do the work, but no room for the use of the word I. This is a team effort, and I want to emphasize that. We cannot get there alone. So let's talk a little bit more closely then about the actual work I'm doing. Cool underwater pictures coming very soon, I promise. Let's talk about what we're actually doing about it. I told you, I promise, cool underwater pictures. Sometimes the visibility is better on some days than others. We're doing quite a bit about it as it happens. At the landscape level, there are more practitioners now, I believe, than there ever have been, and more documented submerged paleolandscape reconstructions and sites and actual materials that have come out of this where we can say, yes, absolutely, this is an archaeological site. It might look very different from a terrestrial one, but we are demonstrating regularly that past received wisdom, that these old sites have been just eroded by sea level rise and they're all gone. Oh, no, no, no. They are not gone. Many of them have survived. It is shocking how well some have survived and how extensive it can be. So when you look at just the studies in the last 25 years and how many locales have been picked up, it is encouraging. There are sites in the Pacific Northwest. And I don't have the sites plotted from the Alaskan Panhandle here in this graphic. In my defense, it's actually not mine. This is from Smith and Foughton Smith. But you can see in Florida, we've got quite a bit. There's the Paleo-Sabine River in Texas. There is the Douglas Beach site on the east coast of Florida that's not plotted. There's stuff down in Central America. There have been prospection efforts done in the Baja. And the list goes on and on and on. This also doesn't show you the various locales that have rendered dredged up stone tool materials from the East Coast in the Mid-Atlantic and New England. All of these sites have one thing in common. They all have very early components, and they all have very key evidence within them, I believe, that will help us put this landscape back together and understand what these human groups faced and how well they faced it. Here is another focused on the American Southeast, just to give you more of a zoomed in view. There's been materials that have been recovered off the Georgia coast as well. I should have mentioned that, especially since I kind of got my start working at Gray's Reef. And this has taught us, these efforts have taught us very important lessons. And the most important one is work from the known to the unknown. Don't get on a boat and go 100 kilometers offshore and throw divers overboard in the Gulf of Mexico and have any expectations they're going to come back with anything. You have to start with the patterns you understand before you can start to add to your knowledge base and help you begin to uncover the patterns that you have yet to learn. So what we tend to do is work with shallow, younger sites on the continental shelf. They're more accessible. They're frankly safer to do prospection on if you're putting divers on them. And this allows us so we can evaluate the site preservation, the site integrity, start thinking about things like, well, do hurricanes destroy these shell middens or not? Or, well, can we still recover wood from an in situ location at these sites or not? Is it any good? And what kind of animal assemblages can we find evidence for? And so on and so on and so forth. It's much easier to do that in 15 feet of water than it is in 50. So moving to a discussion then about site level characterizations, let me share a little bit about some of the nerd stuff that I've been up to in Appalachia Bay. One thing that I run into is the constant question from people that don't work intensively on coastlines or on submerged landscapes. And they always want me to tell them, to explain to them, how do you know that that pile of oyster shell isn't a natural oyster reef? How can you prove to me? How can you demonstrate that that's actually an archaeological site? And it is true, they look quite different. So one of the ways that we do this is we take samples of the soils, of the sediments, of the deposits in these sites, pull them apart. We pull them apart with all different manner of analyses, particle size analyses, chemical analyses, faunal analyses, the list goes on. And we're looking to assess two things. One, is there stuff in there that couldn't be there unless people put it there? And number two, how good a shape is it really in? How does it compare to what we find onshore? How does it stand up to when storms hit? I've been fortunate that I've been able to go out to one of these sites in the wake of 2 different hurricanes and do this kind of sampling, which was really, really fascinating, once in a lifetime sort of opportunity. And this is important stuff that we need to look at, because we cannot offer reliable interpretations until we can say what kind of shape these sites are in. And before we do that, we've got to demonstrate their sites to start with. So the Econfina Channel site is one that I've spent a lot of time on in the Gulf of Mexico in Appalachia Bay. And it probably dates to between 5,000, 4,000 years ago. There may be some components there that are older. And mostly what you see out there today is a quarry zone with rock outcrops, fair amount of seagrass, and a shell midden that's in about 3 meters of water. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. It's not just because it's an underwater site and it's cool, although that's true. It tells us that people were living on a coastline and using coastal resources before modern sea levels were fully established. Again, this blows apart an old myth that people didn't settle on the coastline until the coastline got stable. Absolutely not. They went there as soon as they were capable, it looks like. And they continued to use the site repeatedly, even while there may have been some sea level oscillations that may have covered it up and then uncovered it again. So one thing that we've been after is taking core samples so we can chemically analyze the materials, the deposits out there, and ask and answer how they are different from natural sediments. Frankly, we don't know how big the site is, because every time we go out there and wind up a little bit off target, we find more shell midden. And I don't think we're going to stop working on that site anytime soon, if for no other reason than I'd really like to know where it actually ends. Now, the midden components themselves, that shell deposit, they extend about 30 to 50 centimeters to, a foot and a half below the modern seabed. And it looks like the top part is fairly disturbed to some extent, but the bottom levels of it are really not at all. So we have looked for evidence of, as I like to say, stuff that's there that could only be there because people stuck it there. And those midden for things like bits and bobs of fragments of stone tools, they're there. Charcoal, check, that's in there. Burned oyster, also there. And then certain types of shells from land-based snails, apple snails, turn up in these middens, and they couldn't have got there once it was submerged. And moving back to commenting on the charcoal and the burned oyster, to paraphrase a friend of mine, if you want to light an oyster midden on fire underwater, it takes a strong level of commitment. So, taken together, these multiple lines of evidence say, all right, yes, this particular shell deposit was left behind by human beings before this was covered up by the ocean. The other thing that we did, and this is when we really got in the weeds, pardon the pun, on pulling apart these sediment analyses, we separated all these materials from the midden by grain size, and then ran some statistics that are great. Like, you're welcome to read the paper if you have insomnia. But the TLDR, the take-home message on these statistical analyses, was that the sediment materials from different parts of the site, some of them kind of overlapped with one another statistically, but areas that were off-site, like the channel and the eelgrass zone, were completely different from the stuff that we found in the midden. On its own, it doesn't tell us it's an archaeological site, but taken with the presence of the charcoal and the stone tools and that sort of thing, it really reinforces the point. We had the opportunity to compare these sediments with sediments from a submerged shell midden from off the coast of Denmark in 2019 was when we did the 2019 and 2020 was when we did the analyses, published it in 2021. And when I ran the statistics, I had to run them multiple times before I could convince myself that what I was seeing was in fact legitimate and valid and robust. All of which is to say I didn't believe it at first. And that's because my statistics said that the midden sediments from the Econfina Channel site could not be distinguished, statistically speaking, in a significant manner from these Danish midden sediments from another underwater site that was half a world away. And we also had off-site sediments to compare from below the midden in Denmark and from outside the site boundaries that we inferred that they were outside the site boundaries at Econfina Channel. And once again, the stuff that was off-site separated out statistically from the midden sediments. This needs a lot more study, but if we've got strong evidence that submerged shell middens develop sort of a characteristic size signature, then that might be kind of a big deal. That might really help us in the future if we want to take a core sample from a potential submerged midden. Might give us a method we can use to arrive at to say, oh yeah, look, this plot's right alongside the other middens. It's probably a midden. So that's handy. Like I said, I don't think we're going to stop working there anytime soon. We keep finding all manner of cool things out there. One example, I was working in the lab with two lithic items, two stone tool fragments a few years back as I was finishing up my doctoral studies out there. One piece was from the midden and the other was from a sort of quarry zone around a spring site. There's springs still flowing out there. It's about 50 meters away. I was playing with the pieces and they looked like they might belong together. And at the time, my former grad school major professor was looking at me and he's in the lab with me and he said, "You're not that lucky." And I was like, "Oh, really? Watch this." They refit. So the two pieces are too big to have been carried by wave action. So now we have human activity, right? We've got one fragment of a stone tool getting dropped on the shell midden, and the other one was dropped 50 meters away. That's where the payoff for me really is when you see the little human things come. Well, it's all human, but when you see the activities that individuals carried out, it's very rare you get to see it. But when you do, it makes all of those hours in front of the Excel spreadsheets doing the statistical analyses of grain sizes, it really makes it worth it. So that's the kind of methodological application that we're throwing at these sites and a few others. We're also still trying to zoom out on the landscape of Appalachia Bay and throw some remote sensing methods at these sites to see how well we can detect them without having to put a diver over the side. Because as much as I do enjoy diving, the reality is sometimes you just can't do it. And you definitely can't do it in deeper water. And you can't do it under certain conditions. And sometimes the visibility is terrible and sometimes the weather is bad, right? So any method that we can deploy that will help us detect potential sites for testing, that's useful. One method we're using is a LiDAR analysis. It's sort of a semi-automated method using a geographic information system software that picks out landscape features. We don't have to go down the math and the rabbit hole to talk about the exact method and how it works. Like I said, it's great for curing insomnia if you want to read the paper. But I'll skip to the end, which is to show you the actual LiDAR data sets, which are much higher resolution than anything else we've had out there, right? These are the 3 locales that have been studied. This is the Oscilla Paleo channel, which is very well known for terminal Pleistocene, late Ice Age and early Holocene sites. Econfina Paleo channel, where we've done so much work. And then Ochlocny Shoals to the west. And all of these data sets have been evaluated for seabed features that might correlate to archaeological deposits. The method has highlighted a number of, I'm just going to use the term anomalies. And when we put these anomalies in the mapping software, and then we put site locations next to them, boom, there it is. All 6 of these sites that we have documented on the Paleo Oscilla and on the Paleo Econfina, at least in this data set, turned up within or very close by these anomalies. That's really interesting. Correlation doesn't equal causation, as we know, but that's curious, and it bears further investigation. So that's what we've been up to now for about the last year. So summer of last year was spent diving on potential targets on the Paleo Oscilla. 5 of them were chosen on 1 day's work. 3 of them rendered archaeology, clear evidence of archaeology, and we can't say that there's no archaeology at the other 2 sites. We just can say that we didn't detect any on those dives. We may go back, we may not. But it is fascinating to me that these red targets, right-hand side, turned up right in these anomalies, just right in front of you. And these are some of the materials that were recovered, including a piece of preserved cypress wood that can be dated. So some of this lithic material, some of these stone tool materials are just waste materials that were knocked off when people were making. Another one is an actual form chopper tool. We've done the same thing at the Econfina Paleo channel, and we tested that in late 2022 and detected another shell midden deposit. And that one's huge as well. We don't know the full extent of that either. Raising the question of, is this entire Paleo channel just one big collection of midden? I don't know. But I do know that we're going to continue to go out there and test these deposits and sample them to see if we can get dates on them, to see if we can find stone tools that will tell us something about the lifeways and the technologies people used there. And it might be interesting to think about whether there are different types of coastal resource use. For example, were people just harvesting oysters? Or do we find fishbone deposits in some of these middens? Or do we find scallops or other animals that live in different zones? Scallops are open marine, oysters are estuary, and so on and so forth. The fact that these deposits are so abundant, A, demonstrates my point that these sites are far from gone, and B, I think demonstrates very well the potential for an enormous amount of information to be collected from them. This is it's not a great underwater photo. It has been color corrected, but it's meant to give you a sense of how deep some of these midden deposits can be. They're quite extensive. They're very impressive. Now, the other part of this story that I think is interesting, since we're talking about telling stories, is we told ourselves the story that Ochlocny Shoals should also be a really good place to look because it was probably a barrier island before it was submerged. And yeah, no, absolutely not. We found absolutely nothing on any of these anomaly targets that we dove. Not a thing. We saw a sea turtle. That was kind of cool. A friend of mine got chased by a remora. Another dive buddy of mine decided to take a swing at a black-tip reef shark with his rock hammer, and that was about the most exciting thing that happened. No real archaeology. We did pull up this one lithic item that looks like it kind of wants to look like somebody did something to it a long time ago, but it is in really poor shape. And that was taken from a location that was not associated with one of those LiDAR anomalies. So we'll probably go back at some point. But I don't know that all that sand at Ochlocny Shoals is very good for identifying these seabed features. So we may have identified there a limiting condition for this kind of remote sensing method. It can see the seabed. It can't see below it. That's okay. We have a few other that we can throw at that problem. And the main one that we use for that problem is marine seismic methods. This uses acoustic energy. You take a transmitting item, object. We call it the towfish. You put it in the water and tow it with the boat, and it emits acoustic energy between 4 and 20 kilohertz. And the responses help you reconstruct profile images of the seabed along transect lines. So we took this out in August of last year. We used an instrument called an EdgeTech 424, and we ran lines that were about 100 to 150 meters apart. And you can see here it's kind of in a grid pattern. And this is an actual rendering of the track lines according to our GPS. So this isn't pretty little planned track lines. This is what it looks like in real life. And sometimes, you don't run straight lines, but you do the best you can. You mow the lawn, as we say, as best you can. And we took these data over a number of locales that we thought might be interesting to test. Known sites, sites we'd identified on bathymetric LiDAR studies, and over the Paleo channel. We were testing to see how well we could see the geology. And we wanted most especially to see if these known archaeological sites would render up certain signatures in the data that would say, yep, hi, here I am. We got useful results. The study's still ongoing. It's still preliminary. We were able to see the geology. This is one profile showing you the seabed. There's something called a multiple. It's just like echoes from the acoustic data. You don't pay any attention to those, but it's useful to point them out so people don't think they're real. And then we've got this funny little seismic reflector that's popping up here in this profile. And here is another view, a map view to show you where it was. It's on the northern part of the grid in the northeastern area. So we plopped a target sign on it, threw a couple of divers over the side, and lo and behold, that reflector turned out to be a rock outcrop of chert, which was very highly valued for making stone tools. Now, this location, we couldn't spend a lot of time. The weather was not great that day, and the visibility was very poor. But that's a location to go back to because there may well be archaeology there. The main thing we wanted to know was whether or not that reflector really was geology or something else, and we answered that question. We also looked for these acoustic signatures that other people have reported that may be created by naphtolithics. They're called haystack signatures, and you can see one in the image on the left here. Our results were mixed, and again, this is one of those, okay, we don't really know what's going on, and we're going to put fancy words on it because we're scientists, but the reality is we're just going to have to study it some more. The plan will be to come back out to the Gulf, if not this summer, although it's probably looking like this summer, by next year, 25, and do a lot more intensive work to really get a close look at these archaeological sites that we know about and the ones that might be there and see if these signatures are real. One useful thing that we did get out of running these seismic data was we interpolated the seabed signatures and compared it to the LiDAR. And it turns out that if you run your seismic unit at close enough line spacing, you can reconstruct the seabed as well at a pretty good resolution. Not quite as good as LiDAR, but pretty good. So that's useful as well if you can't get LiDAR coverage. Another thing that we're very interested in is why people lived where they did. And we're starting to notice a few patterns out there. We're noticing that these detected sites and some of our LiDAR signatures and new materials that have come up appear on this submerged paleo channel where it looks like the channel was branching. It's called, the technical term is anastomosing, where the river channels split apart and weave back together again like a braid. I had a look, and I haven't thrown any statistical analyses at this yet. It's my favorite thing to do, in case you haven't figured that out. I like to use statistics to test these observations. It's a pretty robust way to do it. And at some point, I'm going to take a gander at that and see if the math works out. Because when I look at the onshore patterns further upriver on the Osceola River today on land, that's where the sites tend to cluster as well. So stay tuned. That's an exploratory study at the moment, but it might come to something. So that gives you kind of a basic look at sort of the things that we're playing with machines that beep or make noises anyway. We're using a lot of statistics and pulling apart these sediments. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to reconstruct are inferences, evidence for how people lived, when they lived out there, what they preferred to live near, and what kind of lifestyles they led, what sort of did they eat, for example, coastal, non-coastal, etc. So we're planning additional seismic survey, definitely gonna test more LiDAR targets. There is so much to be done in Appalachia Bay. I don't think you can fall off a boat out there without bumping your nose into a site. So I think it will probably keep me fairly well occupied for a good long time to come. So this is all great. I'm having a great time. I can't believe I have a job doing this. I feel very, very fortunate. But while I've gone through all these methods and these really interesting results, it's all very promising. But one thing that I keep coming back to when I look at where we are and where we could be and where we need to go is that right now our field is still kind of defined by disconnection. There's a lack of understanding between people that work onshore and people that work offshore. There's still resistance to findings. We often find that we take tools as archaeologists, apologizing, taken from fields like geology that maybe we don't fully understand. And we apply them to these problems, and when we don't get great results, we think the method's bad, but in reality, our application was wrong. And in the private sector, you've got these developers working with geophysical and geotechnical teams and engineers and whatnot that are not conversant in archaeology. They don't know cultural histories, and they don't know how to put together their data with our data. And the result in the private sector, for those of you who are interested in a job, is that there are not a lot of us on the ground. The cultural resource management firms are practically hauling bodies off the streets at this point. There is so much data to evaluate, so many projects that are in progress, and not enough people qualified to do it. Not enough people who can take a geological method, apply it properly, and understand it from the archaeological perspective, and be able to both talk to the developers and their geological teams, as well as the communities and the terrestrial archaeologists. It can be done, but it's going to take closing the gap, getting professionals trained in the geology, in the geophysics, the sedimentology, all of these fancy words that basically mean you can understand people in the context of their environment. And that can then satisfy what we call a QMA rating, Qualified Marine Archaeologists. This is a Bureau of Ocean Energy Management Standards, particularly American. It's not international, but it signifies that a professional has the skills that in the federal view qualify them to make these determinations. So you need multidisciplinary training. Huge job market. Offshore wind development is accelerating. Another thing that has happened is that tribal consultation with the Native American nations that have ancestral rights to these submerged landscapes, these consultations aren't just a formality anymore. They are quite real. The input is quite valued. The tribes have a very important seat at the table. There is a tremendous amount to learn from them if you approach it with a reasonable mindset, a collaborative mindset. And these tribal historic preservation officers will be setting the standards for investigation. So it's very important that we have enough people working in this sector with appropriate training who are also anthropological archaeologists that understand cultural histories, that can walk into one of these consultation meetings and recognize that there are multiple ways of seeing the world, and the tribal ways of seeing the world are just as useful. And if you're going to protect this cultural heritage, you have to be able to work with them, not just plow over tribal concerns. There are multiple regulatory frameworks in place. They've been in place for many years now, but they're really coming into play. These engines are really revving up, you might say. This is meant to get these offshore developments moving forward, but it's also going to support a lot of acceleration in discovery. Big wind farm projects turn up big archaeology. That's just the way that it is. And these review processes that happen under laws like National Environmental Preservation Act, National Historic Preservation Act, these are going to reveal more and more, I believe, of these preserved cultural landscapes. And it's pushing the developers and the archaeologists hard, because the development companies that want to build these wind farms have to submit their construction and operations plans, including their mitigation for archaeology, to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management within 3 years of obtaining a lease block. And friends, that is light speed. So there is a tremendous need for people in the sector right now who can do this and do this well. The entire project that a development's going to go into offshore has to be evaluated for all resources, including archaeological deposits. And once the regulatory agency like BOEM reads these operation plans and issues a finding that, yes, archaeological resources are likely to be affected, it's called an statement of adverse impacts. That's when consultation with people like the tribes has to begin to figure out how to limit the damage, because it's going to damage them. That's the reality. Stakeholders is a term we often use. It means anybody affected by the project, but in reality, it's going to be your tribal collaborators that are going to have probably the most to say about these submerged cultural landscapes. And there is a lot of negotiating on how to, quote unquote, mitigate. That means go in and recover data as best you can. And you can't just put in a big old excavation block like you do on land on something that's, in 90 feet of water. It's not happening. So it requires a lot of creativity. And again, this comes back to pulling in those geophysics skills and the geology skills, as well as the archaeology, the geochemistry. All of those things really are important when you're working with landscapes that are really difficult to access. You have to access them, though, because if you find a site during a development, you have to determine if it's eligible to be put on the National Register of Historic Places. If it's eligible to be nominated, that language matters. It doesn't mean if it makes it onto the register, but if it is eligible for nomination, it must be either avoided or mitigated. What does eligibility mean? Can that site tell us something about an important historic or prehistoric event? Can it tell us important data about a person? Can it tell us something about an archaeological, technological phase or an architectural period? Or does it teach us something about human history? That's criterion D. All submerged paleolandscape deposits qualify under criterion D because they are so rare, because they have the potential to hold data that does not appear on land, and because they have the potential to preserve organic materials like wood to a much greater degree. Any archaeological site of this nature detected offshore is eligible to be nominated, which means it has to be avoided or mitigated. Mitigation requires all of the parties to come to the table and agree on what they will do to obtain these data. If all of the parties cannot agree, that project doesn't happen. If they do agree, something like a memorandum of agreement or understanding is drafted, and then the developer will carry out that mitigation using a private archaeological firm or three to do the work. But it is very important for you to understand that if the stakeholders don't agree, that is to say, a tribal historic preservation office feels that a mitigation plan is not sufficient, then everything comes to a screeching halt until that agreement can be crafted. And this, again, is where these multidisciplinary folks are so needed to find these scientifically sound and robust ways to recover these data and to do so while working with people in a very culturally sensitive fashion. So I know that's a lot. You knew what you were signing up for, or, well, those of you who know me knew what you were signing up for. I think it's very important, despite the fact that this is a huge information overload to some degree, for us to take all of these different threads, why we care, how we show we care, and what it means for real life and everyday practice. We need all of those three strands in order for us to look to win. A lot to do. There is a lot that will be achieved in the next 10 to 20 years. And I am personally looking forward to the folks coming behind me, coming up now. They're working on their masters and their PhDs that are coming into the field that will take what those of us who are doing it today and move that forward so much further than any of us could ever do. Because I do anticipate more people will come into this field, are coming into this field because of the progress that's been made and because of the tremendous potential to do an enormous amount of good. I've often said, I don't know how much I can make a difference in this world, but if I leave it slightly better than I found it, if there's a little piece of information that I was able to help develop that makes us all a little bit smarter, then I'm going to call that a job well done. And I think what we're going to see is those bits and bobs and small things that I and the people I'm working with Although I tend to downplay my work and talk up those that I think are far smarter than me. And I could name quite a few, but I would like to think that those coming behind us are going to achieve even more as the windward. So, as I said, I know it's a lot. I'm happy to take questions. I appreciate your patience, your tolerance, and your time. And the floor is now wide open.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jessica. Your research is so incredibly amazing. So interesting. So much more than pointy rocks and jumping out of the boat, like you said.
I mean,
So,
there's that too.
so we'll go ahead and open up for questions. If you want to, you feel free to type them, or you can, if you know how to raise your hand like Rachel did, you can do that. That's a little easier to have a little bit of order. So Rachel, go ahead.
Thank you. That was incredible. Thank you so much. I love the science side of everything that you shared, and then also the very practical job side. Thank you so much for covering that. So I work at a university. I'm not a faculty member, but I do work with students. If students are interested in going into this field, are they typically able to get a job like with BOEM or another company without being able to dive? Like, would suggesting that they learn about like the geoarchaeology and like the science and the academic side of it be useful for them? Is there any on the job training, or is it really the companies are looking for someone who can go into the water, collect the samples, and then also process all the data?
Most of the CRM project managers and PIs that I know actually don't. I mean, they often advertise that they want someone who is a diver and AAUS certified. The reality is that the chances that you'll be deployed to do anything in the water are very minimal. And the reason for that is that you're stepping into a really thorny area of bureaucracy around commercial diving. And you're also stepping into a type of diving that can be dangerous. I mean, there is some hard hat diving that's done. I'm not hard hat trained. But the reality is that most of the work you're going to do, if you're doing submerged paleolandscapes, you're going to do at a desk, in a lab, or on a boat reviewing geophysical data as it's collected. You'll be splitting cores. You'll be sampling them. I would never discourage anyone from learning how to dive. I enjoy it. If it's your thing, if it's your jam, have at it. It's not a bad skill to have. I am the only diver at the Submerged Landscapes Research Center at the University of Bradford, literally the only person who does this. And we are the largest research group in the world. So if you are afraid of diving, or you don't want to dive, or you haven't had the opportunity to become a strong swimmer, right? That there are class and privilege issues kind of bound up in this to some degree too. Do not let that put you off. Go take geology. Go take a lot of geology. You'll be fine.
Okay, we have a raised hand from Adam.
Hey, Jess, great talk, great story.
Hey, man, it's good to see you.
I know it's been a while. Any
Yes.
idea on what mechanisms might be causing that particle size grouping for the middens?
My hot take off the cuff is probably that you've got, well, we know we've got small, very small silt size and fine sand size stuff in that midden. And then everything else is small, is fine gravel because it's crunched up oyster shell. You don't have a lot of sizes in between. It's a bimodal distribution. So people walked on these things, I should say, and they break the shell up. There's also stripping of fines that happens when hurricanes come through. That's my suspicion, and we do tend to see more of a preservation in the areas where the eelgrass beds are because it holds the fines in place.
Makes a lot of sense.
I mean, we'll see where it goes. I want to analyze more material for more submerged middens. There's not a lot of them running around, unfortunately, yet.
Just got to get out and go find some more.
I mean, like I said, we have a full dance card for the year.
And thanks for your question. I'll go ahead and ask one while we're waiting. At these sites that you work at, do you find clues on why they preserved? Because it almost seems like it's like a winning a lottery. When you read the literature, it's about sea level rise at sites and storms. It's very doom and gloom, but clearly there's preservation potential. But what are the factors that lead some sites to preserve while others don't?
There's a Venn diagram for one of these to be still in existence. First of all, people had to have been there. Second, they had to have left enough behind that we can find. And then third, that stuff can't have been disarranged such that it's been destroyed. Now, that stuff can be protected in a couple of ways. It can be sealed over, right, by alluvial deposits, like in a river floodplain, in which case you're probably not going to see it without coring, and that's very difficult. For anything to survive on the seabed, you really do need lower energy conditions, at least during submergence. The most dangerous time for a site like this is when it is in the wave zone, right? When it's right at the margin of the coastline and waves are rolling over it constantly. And that's because there's so much energy in the surf zone compared to on land or below the wave zone, right? So if a site doesn't sit in the wave zone for very long, like if sea level rise is really rapid, then it won't get seriously eroded. If the wave zone is not very energetic, so if you've got a really low energy coast, that will help as well. And then it seems like certain types of deposit might hang together a little bit better than others, like shell middens seem almost unkillable. And it seems to be the case where fresh water percolates through the oyster midden and redistributes the calcite. So it kind of it's almost like concrete, right? So it tends to kind of not seal together, but hang together and cement together is the word I'm looking for, a bit better. So yeah, I mean, and the other thing is sometimes we just don't even know why they preserved. It just seems to be some kind of dumb luck. They got sealed over, and now they're exposed, and part of that question is still very much in progress, to be very candid with you.
Yeah, thank you for that response. So I've been working at sites in the intertidal zone, so really just getting my feet and ankles wet, not
Mhm.
And what we see in Tampa Bay, which is a very large estuary, but generally speaking, low energy, is a lot of wetland encroachment, and in some cases, finding shell midden beneath a meter plus of peat. And
Mhm.
we're kind of thinking that this is possibly going to preserve it in the future, at least temporarily, until that gets transgressed, or what comes next, we don't know. Yeah, but thank you for your response.
Yeah, yeah, that peat will definitely. Peat is what we look for in the seismic data from Northern Europe. It
Okay,
preserves things extremely well. Yeah.
awesome. And then we had a question in the chat from Blake. He asked if you have found burials at any of these submerged sites, and if how well they were preserved, if you did find some.
Have not. I am a joke. It's kind of a joke, and it's not meant to be an irreverent one. I say that I live in fear of finding one, and the reason I say that is because I genuinely do not want to disturb somebody's ancestors. The reality is that shell mounds in the American Southeast are known to contain burials. The reality is that we may very well run across that. That's one of the reasons that we tend to just probe these middens, or at most take a core. There's not really a whole lot of sense in doing a big excavation anyway, because it's oyster shell and you want to find just enough material to determine it's archaeological. And beyond that, it's down to geochemical data and sediment data and whatnot. That being said, there are burial sites that have been identified offshore. Unfortunately, at least one of them was looted a bit, which makes me very angry. That site is now very well protected and has been covered up by several tons of sand by Florida BAR. Thank you. And I will always say to people, if you are scuba diving across something that looks human, please do the right thing. And please call the state agencies, because these are people's families, and it's very important to be very sensitive to that. So when I'm asked about burials, I think I always sort of instinctively come back to that point, right? Because it's one thing to pick up a stone tool and to have a shared experience with someone who dropped it 6,000 years ago. It's another thing to disturb someone who's at rest.
Yeah, thank you for that question and the response. Did we have any other questions? Last chance.
And obviously, I have trouble keeping my mouth shut and not talking, so I am always happy to answer questions by email. You please do, don't ever feel that you can't inquire of people that do what we do. We're um, the notion that archaeologists are somehow conspiring to hide some privileged truth is ridiculous. Have you ever met any of us at a conference?
Would you mind typing your email in the chat for anyone who might want to reach out to you?
Not at all. Doing so right now. This is the best one to find me. This is my email at the University of Bradford, and I am there about 6 to 8 months out of the year, and I am at my home in Maryland the rest of the time. But no matter what time zone I am in, I'm always happy to do anything I can to engage in science communication, support folks coming after me. So don't hesitate.
I do have another question. I'm sorry, I just thought of it.
Yeah.
Do you dive under AAUS certification?
I did, and we're actually in the process of untangling British health and safety. Pray for me. British health, well, so Britain, an AAUS approach like we do, so they don't really have scientific diving set aside as an exempt category from commercial diving. So we are working our way through that right now. We're going to be in conversation with Southampton, I think, about this. I may wind up having to get a British commercial diving ticket before it's all done. So whatever, training's always good. But in the US, yes, under AAUS. And I would recommend anybody that wants to do scientific diving to aim for that because it is excellent training.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really good point.
Well, I also just want to know if I can come dive with you. It's part of why I was asking.
Oh, yeah, no, hit me up. If we do come back out, and we may be back out this summer. We're not sure what we're doing this summer. There are about 3 different things we might have to go take care of, but we are happy to have volunteers as long as everybody's properly credentialed, because we are just a few people and we want others to know how to do this properly. And we want people in the community to understand why it's important to protect these resources. So any kind of participation that you can offer is to the good. And if someone doesn't welcome you, then they are not doing their job.
All right. Well, I just want to say thanks again so much, Jessica, for your time and for sharing your research. I guess we'll call
Thank
it
you.
a night.
Really appreciate you guys.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Y'all have a lovely night.
You
Thanks
too.
so much. Bye.
All right, take care.